All right, Victoria, welcome to Psilocybin.
Yes, so good to have you here.
Yeah, so this is a conversation that I am not very well versed in, so I'm hoping that we'll get, to some degree educated, but really what we talked about just now before we started recording, the conversation around psychedelics not necessarily being central to the religious practice, but still being legally permissible within the context of a religion is really a new idea to me, because as we've been working with Sanctuary, it's just been, this is the law and we're going to follow the law, I think there's a misunderstanding perhaps that a lot of psychedelic users are just out there trying to break laws and couldn't be farther from the truth. So maybe if you could just give our guests, we'll do an introduction beforehand, obviously, but just, tell our guests just a brief about yourself.
About me. I'm thinking about what you were just saying about centrality, but we'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there.
So I feel like I've been on this journey to be able to do work, helping support and help furthering the future of religious use of psychedelics for a while. I would say 6, 7, 8 years, maybe. I studied religion as an undergrad. I went to college in LA, grew up on the East Coast. So in California, was exposed to drugs and medical cannabis and a culture that was very different and shaped by that, and realized also that I was studying religion as a major, and then within religion, there was history around research with use of psychedelics. There was case law having to do with religious use of psychedelics. So I saw that there was this intersection emerging, and it really motivated me to think about long-term how I can be an active part of helping the psychedelic future and creating the psychedelic future. So I was in grad school for 6 years. I did a Master's of Divinity at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, where I studied religion and law and looked at psychedelic research and, history of secular and spiritual practices in the US, among lots of other cool spiritual and religious ideas. And then went to law school, where I also really focused on laws relating to drugs and religious freedom. And then I am a nerd, and also I think that there's a lot that is held in the tax code as relates to religious organizations. So the IRS is one of the biggest ways that religious organizations have to deal with the government. And so I was motivated, and I'm really into religious use, but I also am a medical cannabis patient. I'm passionate about access to all kinds of medicines that are illegal and scheduled, and cannabis, psychedelics. And so taxes are a huge, huge part of creating access through all legal markets. So both on the religious side and the access side, I really was motivated to study tax. So last year I did an additional degree, a law degree at Georgetown, focusing on tax, and very, very heavily focused on taxes related to religious organizations, and did some research there. Where I really just collected information about all the different psychedelic religions that are out there, how they're talking about their tax status, how they're approaching their tax status, and trying to use that as a lens to understand what this landscape looks like and what other approaches we might have besides this DEA exemption bottleneck BS, from my perspective. And so that, I think, led me to Gary's podcast and has led me here. And I'm starting my practice as part of a law firm, Parlator Law Group, where I really have the freedom to build up and bring in the kind of work I want to do. So it's ranged from some psychedelic and cannabis businesses, but also nonprofits, tax-exempt orgs, religious communities. So I'm really excited to see what I can do to help further this movement. And then I guess one other piece on this is I'm the wife of a rabbi. So I grew up Jewish. I'm in a Jewish community. And so to me, lived religion is not just something to study or talk about, but community is just a huge part of my life. And so when I have ideas around how, drugs, for example, like alcohol could be a part of community, or cannabis or psilocybin, it's kind of rooted in how I understand my own religion as a Reformed Jew. So that was a lot, but I think all of those pieces work together to bring me here.
Yes. So yeah, everything that you just said, and so much more that I heard on Psychedelic Lex with Gary. When you were on that podcast, it's like every level that you presented, I just kept being like, yes, like we've got to talk with her, because Eric and I, being in the world of psychedelic organizations for since 2013, and navigating that world and meeting different professionals to help us navigate that world, particularly attorneys, and then the whole world of tax mixed up in there. It's just been such a foggy, like blurry, what do we do? And, very experienced professionals in their field advising us have just been like, like when it comes to what you all are doing, it's just kind of like, I don't know. So hearing you speak, someone who's actually immersed in community and has been immersed in community and has this like wonderful mix of this niche, is just like, oh, like you're such a gem in the psychedelic organization world. So I'm just, so excited to learn more.
Well, this, I was hoping that your kind of extended bio there would bridge us into the conversation around non-centrality, and you bringing up the Jewish background certainly does. And this is, I think, one of the more compelling conversations within the religious use. And it's something that I have been really curious as we're seeing, we just saw a Jewish practitioner in Colorado get arrested. And can you just take us into this world of psychedelics, the potential for psychedelics to be included in religious practice without being necessarily central to the religion, and how we work that into a legal framework?
It's a big question, and thank you for the kind words. Well, I would say, just as a matter of making sure the listeners and everyone knows, right now the law's perspective is that if because these are criminal laws, they're general criminal laws, if you want to advocate that you have a right to use them, you need to show the government's burden is substantial. And the way that they look at that is whether or not your use is central. Because how could the government's burden be substantial if this wasn't such an essential, important part of your practice? And from looking at the research, just really, I spent hours just looking at all the different psychedelic religious communities that are public facing and seeing how they're organizing themselves and what they're talking about. And I actually found that this framework, this requirement of centrality, sort of like has the impact of forming communities that then the drug use is central. And some of them look more like commercial ceremonies. And I do think we're going to see a legal framework in the long term where you do have some licensed commercial spiritual use, maybe in Oregon, maybe other places. But from my perspective, true community shouldn't need to be licensed or subject to the same regulations. So that would be maybe more of the church framework and what that would look like. And I mean, I don't think, like, when you talk to someone using common sense about religious practice and real religious community, people don't say, oh, well, the wine is the most important thing to my Jewish community. No, it's the community. It's the belonging. It's the showing up for services and support groups. It's all these other things that you do where the sacrament is just one piece of it. And I understand in some traditions, like the sacrament is, interaction with the divine. But for me, interaction with the divine, it also comes through community. It comes through music. It comes through, feeling connected. It comes through being comforted when you're grieving. I mean, all these other things that make you feel whole through religion, I think are missed when we say to communities, if you want to be legally defensible, then your use has to be the most important thing. And you need to show that, like, you couldn't have a religion without it. And to me, I mean, you've heard me say that. It's like, why should it have to be like that? And from a Jewish perspective, you're already seeing that there are movements, and I speak for my own, but it could be true for Christianity as well, or other, I would say, generally accepted religious categories like Buddhism or Christianity, Judaism, where why would you have to use it every single time, or why should it have to be central? Like, you could have a cannabis event once a month, or you could have a psilocybin microdosing on certain holidays, or macrodosing, or you could do special retreats where people want to, just like a Jewish community might have a weekend meditation retreat. Why wouldn't they be able to have a weekend psychedelic retreat? But it shouldn't have to be the most central thing. And I really, when I speak sometimes to my own community or people I know in these communities, like, that's going to be some of the strongest advocates for religious use of psychedelics are going to be these communities that are already big established religious communities saying to the government, like, we don't need the DEA exemption. Like, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't have to do that for wine. We want to use something that is already starting to be legal at the state or federal level, and like use that in our ceremonies as we want to, as people want to. And what the health requirements for that should be are, an open question. I certainly don't think that the current requirements of the DEA exemption. So if you are able to get a DEA exemption, which the long and short of it is it's very difficult and you're probably not going to get it. But if you were going to get it in Magic World, you would be subject to the same DEA requirements as researchers. And I don't think that's a good place for religious communities in the first place. So to me, the DEA process is kind of a non-starter, besides the fact that it's pretty unconstitutional and no practitioners are doing it. So for all those reasons, it's like we can beat our head against that wall. So one thing I've thought about, which I've talked about in my research and I think on Gary's podcast, at least in the short term, would be having the IRS because right now, I mean, when people say, oh, who in the government should be deciding what religion is? Well, like no one. No one should be. We should be able to do what we want. And that's not really how it is right now, right? Like a lot of churches do get their 501c3 determination letters because it allows them to raise more money. It allows them to rent property. It allows them to open bank accounts. So if we can get through that IRS, like if the IRS says that you're a religion, they have their 12 factors, we should change those. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done on the IRS front, but if that is already the agency who's deciding what a religion is, then I think trying to push towards that being the agency that like it shouldn't matter if you use psychedelics. And there are communities that have gotten their C3 status, they apply to the IRS, they may not disclose their use of a scheduled substance, they get their approval. They're a church in the eyes of the law. It shouldn't matter that they use psychedelics. And then it's like, okay, well, if you want to use it, what should be the requirements? Like, I think that should be the conversation. It shouldn't be, oh, I have to prove to the DEA that I'm sincere. We should sort of like switch the burden back onto the government. Like, you prove to us that we're not sincere. Like, we're a religion, we're doing our thing. I just unloaded a lot of ideas on policy, but hopefully that answered that question. And I'm happy to take any follow-up to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what it has me thinking of is that what you're talking about has the potential to completely change the face of religious practice in the United States. You know, if non-psychedelic religions, so to speak, start adopting this as a legitimate practice, then what does that look like in 20 years for the Christian faith or the Jewish faith or Islam, whatever it is? You know, it's phenomenal to consider.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of went ahead and started to answer the question that was simmering in my mind was 508 C1A versus 501 C3, and like getting your feedback on that. I'm super curious about that. Obviously, or you probably already know, Sanctuary is clear on our website. We're a 508, and you know there's different reasons for that. But the whole process of getting that determination letter as a 501 was kind of part of that, and being told that, you know, that's not likely for you all. So hearing you say that there have been psychedelic churches that have gotten that determination letter is a little surprising to me. But it sounds like they haven't disclosed the full picture.
Yeah, exactly. Which they would argue that their use is religious, right? And it's not illegal. And this is something, I mean, I talked about on Gary's. Like, I talked to a lot of practitioners. I looked at a lot of websites. I looked at corporate filings. I looked at C3 lookup. I mean, there are definitely approved churches. I feel comfortable saying that if they disclose their use, they're not approved. So I think that's like a pretty hard line. But there are legal ways to say, oh, well, we're talking about our sacrament. It shouldn't matter what it is. And that the idea that you have to disclose is sort of a burden on religion. Like, I think there's legal arguments that those communities who may have not fully disclosed could make. But on the 508c1a versus C3 debate, I think it's funny to me a little, because I took classes at Georgetown last year on nonprofit tax and tax exempt orgs with like leaders in the field, right, who helped like write these laws and do some of these cases. And 508c1a as like a designation does not come up. Like, what gets talked about is if you want to be, churches are 501c3s and they are exempt from filing requirements. But the idea is actually that even if they're not required to file, they're still required to comply with the exact same laws. So this idea to me that like you're a 508c1a, so you're exempt from 501c3 requirements is not actual. But the truth of it is that the IRS is not going after churches. I mean, they're really not. It requires a high-level Treasury official. It requires they're underfunded as is. Why are they going to go after people that don't have money? And the constitutional law issues related. So the layers on that, it's okay, well, what is the law? The law says that if you're going to be a 501c3 or you're going to be a 508c1a, that you can't be organized for an illegal purpose. The government would say, you're using drugs. That's illegal. The community says, this is our constitutional right. This is a religious use. Right? That's going to be the argument. And we're already seeing it. The ayahuasca church is going to sue the IRS. If I can keep talking about the IRS, hopefully more people will be able to sue the IRS. But it sucks because it's so expensive and a pain in the ass to sue these agencies. So I'm trying to think legislatively. I'm trying to think about all the education is huge, because even if we do sue, if the judges have this idea around what psychedelic religion has to be, that might still be limiting. So, I mean, I'm really thinking about it from an all angles approach. But right now, I don't think there's any good choice for you, unfortunately. You could form an entity at the state level or not. You could form an entity at the state level and you're all doing, we're a church. We don't have to file. The IRS would probably say you're still supposed to be C3 compliant. Some state nonprofits, when you form the state nonprofit, they make you attest to being 501c3 compliant. I was looking at the laws in Kentucky. I don't think you have that problem as much because there's just really nice religious freedom laws there, or nice for some people and in some situations, but
right.
Yeah.
Good for your purposes as well. You can apply to the C3 and not disclose, but there's risks involved with all of it. I think the benefit to me of the 508c1a approach is that you're not lying to the IRS. That's a positive, right? No one's going to come after you or people who sign that paperwork and say, oh, penalty of perjury. You can get a felony for lying to the government. So some of these people that have applied, but again, risk of enforcement is pretty low. So in my work, I try and say, here are the four, here are some approaches. You could, incorporate and do nothing. You could incorporate and call yourself a 508c1a. You could apply for C3 and get accepted and lie potentially. You could apply and get denied. But none of those will legally protect you either. And right. if you're trying to, but in a court case, I think it's interesting. I've heard it go both ways. I think the act of applying for C3 status does help communities get organized. And you might have an argument in the government, if you did get charged, you might be able to say, hey, the IRS said we're a church. It shouldn't matter that we use psychedelics, right? And that could work for you. But then the other side, they would probably say, well, you lied to the IRS. So how can we trust that you're sincere? I mean, it's really a lose-lose because the government in this situation is wrong. And so, but they are taking a hands-off approach.
We are acting as if internally, as if we are a 501 and doing everything as a 501 should do, like you said, organized and prepared for anything. But it has already presented in little ways, surprising little ways. Being a 508, it has its limitations. For instance, PayPal. PayPal won't recognize a nonprofit because they're 508 what? What's that? That's not a nonprofit. What are you talking about? And we're no, it is. And they're oh no, we need to see your 501 determination letter. So, yeah.
Well, just expand on this conversation of kind of the comparison and contrast of these public corporations versus the religious organizations, and how now we have an example in Oregon of them being treated the same, which seems completely contrary to everything that we ever have had precedent for within religious practice in the United States. So can you just kind of talk us through what's going on there and how does this unfold?
So I think you're talking about the, the entheogenic framework that was proposed in Oregon. Yeah. This has been a tough thing for me to grapple with. It's cool. So I'm a part of the Psychedelic Bar Association. I'm on the Religious Use Committee. So I get to connect with a lot of other practitioners, including John Dennis, who helped draft that work. And when he first talked to me about it, I really had to sit with it because to me, religious use doesn't belong in a licensed commercial framework. It just doesn't. Mm-hmm. So, and then when he said, and I think that the idea of how do we license religion or how do we permit religious use is a really important one, and one I'm thinking a lot about. And the Oregon example that John drafted was really well drafted and based off the DEA exemption and the case law and all these great things. But to me, like, I don't want, sort of like how our conversation started, the case law is wrong in terms of how it's viewing religious use. So I don't even know if that's really, and the DEA exemption is wrong to me. And so the more I've thought about it, he's like, the proposal is to say, okay, religious communities can get licensed by the Oregon Health Authority, but they're supposed to be exempt from a bunch of these requirements. And from like a constitutional law perspective, this framework of religious exemptions requires you to prove for each specific exemption why the religious freedom right outweighs the public health need for each specific one. And that to me seems, and that's the reason Oregon Health Authority has come out and said, we're not going to do this. We're setting ourselves up for challenges on also the reverse. So they're setting themselves up if they were to do this. And this is something we should be wary of, because when the law starts favoring religion within this like licensed framework, and I said this, I think, on Gary's podcast, it's analogous to when you think about affirmative action, where they're saying we're going to choose race and we're going to try and give preferences to race to benefit, diversity, and I think that could be a good thing to do. But from the eyes of the law, people can challenge that under an equal protection framework. So for Oregon, people could say, hey, why do the religious communities not have to comply with any of these regulations? And they would challenge that. If you're trying to be a licensed for-profit in Oregon and there's a religious community that can offer the same services way cheaper because they don't have to comply with the same regulations, why would anyone do the licensed for-profit, which I think would be a good thing. But I think people want to do the licensed for-profit model. And so that's why Oregon is saying, we really can't subject ourselves to this kind of potential litigation and challenges. And then not to mention the tax issues, because you're not supposed to be collecting taxes from a church. That's like a pretty basic idea behind tax exempt status for lots of reasons, not being able to have the churches run the government, and also to promote, I think, these kind of charitable activities. So one of the reasons I see for nonprofits, whether they be religious, educational, healthcare, the whole idea is we want to incentivize this type of behavior. If people can avoid paying taxes by forming these organizations, then maybe they'll do it more and they'll provide services to the community and it'll be a helpful thing. So it's in this weird way the government's incentivizing community, but to try and fit the church or religious community within the licensed tax framework, specifically because of 280E, which I don't know if you've talked about yet, but it's a tax code section that really affects cannabis businesses. It's a federal tax code section that also is at the state level, although some states like New York or California and more are deciding to not apply at the state level. But basically, if you're trafficking a controlled substance, which the IRS, the tax court, has said includes selling cannabis in a legal framework and will include selling psilocybin in a legal framework, you can't take any of the normal business deductions. Like your salary, your rent. I mean, it's a nightmare. So like cannabis businesses, this is one of the biggest reasons the legal cannabis industry is failing. And the same law is going to apply to psilocybin in Oregon. Mm-hmm. It will shift once the FDA, if there's rescheduling. So it applies to Schedule 1 and 2 drugs. So if there is movement, but right now the IRS is making like, you're paying income tax on income you don't have as a cannabis company, which is why a lot of them can't survive. Right. And so I don't even want that to be an issue for religious organizations in Oregon, because they shouldn't be paying taxes in the first place. And then particularly why this nonprofit tax exempt model can be so amazing is to try and not have those tax burden issues. So to me, it's a separate path. So like, I think hopefully one of the things that the Religious Use Committee, and hopefully with John and other great advocates in Oregon, and we'll do it in more places, is to have a different legal framework. Like we just need to decriminalize religious use. We need Colorado has 2 bills right now. I'm not sure if the second one made it on the ballot, but one of them was a more broad decrim, and it included religious and non-religious use. And I think that is a model that would, all that other litigation that those challenges, those lawsuits that people could bring would be lessened in a decriminalization framework that didn't just give special treatment to religious use. Which is where I think we should be anyways, because no one should be going to jail. This shouldn't be criminal anyway. But we're so focused on this licensed tax framework, and it's like, that's not what we need for religious use, I don't think.
I will say that in response to the beginning of your statement there about, why would anyone want to pay all this money to go to these licensed regulated facilities when there's this super cheap option of this religious community and service. And I will say there are probably a lot of people that would pay, because we found that although I agree with like a lot of what you just said, there are a lot of people that we have found that are just super allergic to like the term church and even community. They're just like, their level of religious trauma is so high that they're allergic to it completely. And they will pay like $10,000 to go to somewhere they can just go, have the treatment and leave, and not even deal with all of that. Just an interesting point that I've found very interesting since we've started Sanctuary.
I think it's an interesting question too, because when I think about those organ, like religious licensees, to me, they're not even churches. I mean, I hear that too. I talk about religion and being religious, and people are like, I hate religion. Religion sucks. And I'm like, no, that's your idea, your experience. And religion is good and bad, just like everything else. And it's powerful, no doubt. But I think that those, to me, were going to be more like spiritual alternatives. Like, I don't even know if they were going to be churchy, but I hear your point. And there are always going to be people who want it through the FDA, and there are always going to be people who want it through that certain model. But I think it's a fair point for sure.
To me, that's an incredible irony as we continue to work in this field, if you will. You know, I've personally been 25 years almost now. I've been publicly advocating for psychedelic use. You know, we started this retreat. It's just been a long road for me. And there is a bit of, I have a certain level of discomfort with these plants and fungi being primarily viewed through the medical lens, when even the research clearly shows us that the mystical experience is where the majority of the healing comes from. So it's like we're coming at this thing backwards, and I'm wondering what is the evolution of this going to be? You know, it's just, do we have anything that is comparable to this? I can't think of anything in history that has a similar, comparison.
That's a hard question. I think something I was at this conference last week, which was awesome, in Ohio, called Psychedemia. So it was all these psychedelic researchers, a lot of them medical model. And it was so funny to me. Like, there was a few speakers on religious use. There was a woman who presented a PhD work on the Santo Daime dancing, which was incredible. And there was another Divinity school student at the time, and he's interested in how ideas around chaplaincy can support educating religious leaders, which I think is really a cool connection, because we do train religious leaders through chaplaincy. But majority of the conference was really medical model. And the assumption was, we're talking about patients, we're talking about indications, whatever. And I just left it kind of laughing, because it's like, majority of the people in this country are not accessing it through the medical model, and they won't for a very long time. Most people are getting it through religious communities, or through spiritual commercial ceremonies, or decrim gray market models. I mean, that is the heart of it. So I so agree with that. And in terms of where we're going, I mean, like I said, I'm trying to attack it from as many perspectives as possible. So the decrim efforts, making sure that they decrim religious use and social sharing. And then as the FDA starts coming down, I mean, I've started talking about it. I just want to keep talking about it until we can make it happen. Because once the FDA approves a drug, you can have off-label use. So doctors can prescribe it for uses besides the indication. But I think that we have enough science, to your point, about these being mystical, spiritual, and we have enough history to say, well, we should also be able to have non-drug use of FDA-approved drugs called entheogenic use. So I've said this in Gary's podcast, and hopefully someday it'll land with someone who's like, I want to help fight the FDA on this. But I think it would just take some conversations to say, this is an approved drug, people are accessing it. Maybe a religious nonprofit could make a partner with let's say MAPS, who will probably have exclusivity over MDMA, and say, we're going to come together and form a partnership, and the FDA is going to give us the okay to develop sacrament that is a non-drug, synthetic sacrament. And I know you've talked about this too, having how to distribute safe sacrament. And some people will want to cultivate their own, and also many people won't want to cultivate their own and will want safe sacrament. And having, to your point too, having that FDA check mark, oh, this is GMP, this is synthetic, this is regulated to some degree, sacrament. To me, that will be a huge access point. I just don't know how long it'll take for us to get there.
Yeah, that's seems like the big question as we keep talking about this. And I don't know. Is it safe? Some people are saying 2 years, and we were saying 5 years. I feel like if we look at cannabis, we're how far out on legal cannabis, and the federal government still has it as a Schedule 1. People say that rescheduling something is as easy as an executive order, I think, but like the cultural shift that has to occur before that is just enormous.
Yeah.
Well, something that came up with John Dennis's work and the Entheogenic Council's opinions on that, and bringing that into Measure 109 in Oregon. That was such a big part of it, was the sacrament cultivation. I felt like that kept coming up in those public hearings from practitioners is, I don't want, like, my sacrament is sacred. Like, I don't want to have to be forced to prove anything about it, or pay to like prove it safe, or, when
the inability to use wild harvested. Like, I'm still really upset about that. We collect a lot of wild psilocybin here for our services. And what more exemplifies this as a connection to God and nature than you going out and finding your own sacrament? So I don't know. There's like so much of this. This is so sticky. It's so convoluted that, fortunately in Kentucky, we have such strong religious protections, but my belief has just been like, everybody else can sort that shit out. This is my practice. This is my faith. And I'm going to practice it in the way that I feel is true.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious, Victoria, about your personal experience with psychedelics and like how like that has informed your practice and your career that you're forming right now.
Yeah, we're talking about all my favorite things. So my brain is like, wow, I could talk about all those more, but we'll keep all the conversations going. Psychedelics really found me, which when I was a little later on and meeting people who were so desperate for finding psychedelics was really hard for them. They'd be like, well, where did you get your first psychedelic? Or how did you find XYZ? And I'm like, honestly, I just put myself out in the world as who I am, and like the right people and experiences came to me. Really being in California, I think, is a huge part of that. And being around open-minded people. So I feel like I don't have like one or two experiences. I have dozens of experiences over years in different settings. And I think one thing that sticks with me from my own experience, which is very interesting, is that I've never had anyone like lead my experience for me. I'm just not there yet. It's just not felt, which is a whole other, individual religious freedom rights, the right to use it by yourself. We're not even close to that conversation yet. But I'm there in my head, in my soul, that I have the right to use these things in ways that help me. And, sometimes it's at a festival or, I think knowing I wanted to study religion in graduate school, was something that I realized while using psychedelics, this validation that this path that I was on was right, and that I was headed towards, this journey and on this way that I was supposed to be are things that came to me through experiences. And then, I think that so when I was in grad school in New York, I did a psychedelic integration group at the Center for Optimal Living, which was just like, it was a therapeutic center with some researchers. And it was interesting. It was both like personal and professional for me, because I was thinking like, well, this is sort of a framework for how churches might use this, like group therapy to help people integrate, although religious services look different. And like personally, I was still experimenting. I'm interested in microdosing. I'm interested in macrodosing. I'm interested in how it helps my personal relationships. And I said this to someone the other day, like I experimented with microdosing during the beginning of law school, which was a little bit of like a reckless, like, oh, well, I want to see how it helps me learn as I'm learning something new. And it was like, actually legal writing is still not fun when you're on a little bit of acid. But I ended up doing pretty well in law school. So I don't, I think it's cool to experiment and to deepen my own relationship with psychedelics. But being in that integration group, it was very cool to meet so many people who had been brought to psychedelics later in their life. Then, their 30, 40, second career, third career, even later, which is amazing. And saying, oh, I found something that helps me heal. And now I want to change my whole career. But for me, like it all happened at the same time. Like I've been like integrating my whole life. So like, because I started having psychedelics at 18 and I was in school, like my career has really been my integration. And now I'm working on a book slowly but surely. That's a collection of essays that I've written over the last 6 years. And that feels like really deep integration work for me, to be like, these are the things I was thinking about and how I was seeing it and where I was trying to go and how can I pull all these experiences that I've had to help. You know, like it's easy to get stuck like, oh, I'm studying tax law, so what I think about is tax. But it's cool to read an essay from 4 years ago when I was studying religious studies and kind of like pull all these threads together. So I feel blessed that I get to live a life like you two. I mean, I hear from some of listening to your work that your life is in some ways your integration as well.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, and the practice itself. It's how do you get involved with the work and not have it find tendrils of it throughout your life? You know, we had an individual who worked as a cleric on one of our recent retreats, and he just went through the cleric training with us, and he's been really involved with the community. But his last psychedelic experience was, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. And it's just, how many things in this world can you do one time or a handful of times, and you're willing to devote the rest of your life to it? You know, and what does anything speak to the religious experience more than that?
It's so beautiful. Like just when have these experiences and you just realize the depth of what it means to like feel and what it means to be and to be connected. I feel like that's so hard to come back from. You're like, oh, wow, I know what that is like. And like, that's that insight. And then it's like, well, how do I make my whole life give me that feeling? You know, like I always think like sometimes like the best psychedelics is like, oh, like my life not on psychedelics is almost as good as my life on, you know, because I'm doing the work of integrating and being present and being connected and being full, but it's not easy.
Yes. So you brought up LSD, which is one of my favorite compounds in the world. Thank you very much for bringing that up. And I have been really like, we don't have any LSD churches right now, and that I know of anyway. That's got to be the margin, the distance that is from our center right now is enormous. But I've been wanting to talk with someone who could at least, wrap their head around this conversation in terms of something like LSD being given or being used as a religious sacrament. Like, where do we even begin with that? This is fascinating.
Yeah.
How real is that?
I mean, well, that's a whole other question. One's the legal and one's the how real is it? And, I've written.
Well, the legal question, the real refers to the legal. It's really a religious experience.
It's really real. All right. Because this question of like, well, because some people say, oh, well, I don't want to be like not sober, or like I don't want to be in a life that's not real. And like to me, life on LSD is a little more real. Like my perception is bigger. It's not like I'm less myself. But legally speaking, I kind of see this be fleshed out a bit in like the decriminalized nature movement, where you see people trying to draw this line. And I think it's not a helpful line in a lot of ways between synthetics and naturally occurring substances. And it's not helpful because like the FDA is going to approve psilocybin that is synthetic, and it might be better. It's just like this, oh, well, if it's synthetic, it's and especially in terms of FDA, like if they regulate the synthetic, we might still be able to use the naturally occurring. There's a lot of open questions there. But with LSD, I think one of the reasons people have justified doing this split between synthetic and natural is this idea of like, well, I'm not going to be synthesizing LSD or MDMA in my church. We're just going to be growing it. It's a plant. It's a fungi. It just grows. But I don't think that's fair. I think that's like okay, well, then that's why we need to have these religious nonprofits that have relationships with, people that are producing safe. Like quality control is important. And so once we get that piece down, then I think we can have MDMA, we can have LSD, but figuring out what that looks like legally and what the limitations are going to be. But to me, we're going to get more and more research on LSD, on MDMA, and I hope that as they're approved as drugs and people use them, and we keep pushing forward these conversations, people are going to be interested. People are going to go to their doctor and be able to get MDMA and eventually LSD and psilocybin, and then want to go to their community. Some people, to Courtney's point, go to their community and say, hey, what do I do with this experience? Like, it's going to take a little time, but I think we'll get there. And I actually think that cannabis will help us get there. So even though, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it's still scheduled. That tax code section I brought up is one of the big reasons. The government is making a ton of money off of cannabis being illegal. So figuring out how to shift that will be huge. But I do think we're in store for a federal cannabis movement within this decade. And then the arguments around a church using cannabis shift. And then like cannabis also has synthetic forms. Cannabis has processed forms. So some of these arguments that I want to be making about cannabis in this decade, we should be able to make about LSD in the next decade. So it's like, okay, once a church can access synthetic drugs, like what is that? But I haven't seen LSD churches either, but I also don't think we would see them. I think, I think they exist. 100% they exist, but because of the frameworks that exist,
Did you see or listen to William Eckerd? Is that his name? At Psychedemia?
No.
What's his name?
Oh, sorry. Gosh, I'm blanking on the name. Silo recently was released from prison. Oh God, Leonard Pickard.
Yeah. So that was an early morning keynote the day after the after party. I didn't make it. I have seen him other times recently, and I actually will hopefully see him again in a few weeks. But yeah, an LSD legend.
Didn't he fall in a vat of LSD or something like that? Okay.
But I would love to go back to the cannabis. Okay, so for many years before I used cannabis religiously for many years. I was very deeply embedded within the Rastafarian culture, and it has still confounded me how cannabis, at least there's been one case precedent, I think it was in Kansas, maybe somewhere in the Midwest, where there was a Rasta who was busted for weed, and he tried to use it as religious exemption. And I'm still so confounded how that plant has such a long history of spiritual use from, throughout, and yet it did not pass the sincerity test. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes people are like, but there's a history, but there's so much safety evidence. And it's like, if our drug policy was rooted in history or safety, it would look so different. Alcohol and tobacco would be scheduled. Cannabis would not be. It would be like our most popular medicine and garden plant. And I love cannabis. I'm a medical patient and have been for, I guess, going on 9 years, and a daily cannabis user. So it's like, it's religious, and it's also just, healing and personal, and all of these things that come together for me. I think most of the cases have been around cannabis have been bad, and for the same reasons that the sincerity test is bad, because the government shouldn't be thinking about sincerity for these religions. But I think a lot of them, when they're making, and there's also plenty of cannabis ministries. I mean, I've started to have people reach out to me about starting cannabis churches, and obviously it's the same kind of analysis, like, what does your RFRA in your state look like? And then I think, to me, the other question is, well, is it legal at the state level where you are? Because that changes the calculus for these questions. And there is a movement of cannabis churches that exists. And there's that one in Indiana, and then there's one in Colorado. I think a big question that you probably also struggle with is whether these are trying to be dispensaries versus being communities. I just mean in the psychedelic world, not necessarily you personally, but psychedelic religious communities have the same, like Zydor in Oakland. Like, I think they actually, seems like they got more in trouble for selling cannabis actually than they did for any other activities that they may have been doing. So like, when a church is trying to be a dispensary, that's a clear hard line. But I think the idea of when a church is trying to be a church and have, membership dues, and I'm a Jew, but churches is a religious org in the eyes of the law. So I'll use that word to describe any religious community, knowing that it's a Christian term. But, if a religious community, a church, wants to use cannabis in a state that it's legal, I think that starts changing that case law, because the arguments around, well, this is federally illegal, and especially once we have federal movement, the First Amendment arguments you're going to be able to make. You're not going to be able to say, oh, well, this is illegal, so you can't do it. Well, what the burden is going to look like is different. And then I think we get into the same conversations that I think Oregon is starting to have, which is a cannabis church required to be subject to the same regulations as a dispensary? Can a cannabis church have a community garden? What do they need to do to comply with state and local regulations to have a community garden and to make edibles and use them as part of their practice? Those are going to be the questions, because once it's legal, the criminality, I mean, you can get in trouble for being an unlicensed dispensary. That's what I'm saying. Like, that line is still there in states where it's legal. I don't know. Did that add clarity to that question, or make it less clear?
I don't know. I guess, how can you clarify something that is inherently so clouded? That the fact that the government is weighing in on our religious practice is just there is no way for me, I don't feel like, to reconcile that people are going to jail still for cannabis, and particularly someone who is, an obvious religious practitioner. Right now, one of the main public frustrations I have around drug laws, or the drug culture, let's say, is that we are rallying as a nation to pull someone, extract someone from Russia over a cannabis charge, when we have how many millions of people are still doing time in the US for cannabis? It's just like our reasoning is just out the freaking window, and we're just like, case by case, what do we want to do here? It just doesn't make sense.
Well, it brings up an interesting point for me around psilocybin, and is right now, like, the resurgence or the blowing up of psychedelic churches right now, that's just starting, is that setting a precedent for religious or entheogenic use before regulation occurs on the state and federal level? Like with cannabis, that didn't happen. Like, there weren't, to my knowledge, many cannabis churches that were proving sincerity, or any of them, before the dispensaries and the medicalization of cannabis really happened. Does that make sense? Kind of what I'm getting at.
Saying that we are preemptively, look at sanctuary. Kentucky is decades away from legal psilocybin access, right? But when they do, or if they do, will they be looking to organizations like Sanctuary to help provide guidance in what that looks like? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Maybe not so much guidance, but because what I'm hearing from Victoria is that, okay, there's this precedent set in right now with dispensaries and regulation, and there's all this regulation that's already rolled out on a government level, and to then try and form cannabis churches and have that access, and for then dispensaries to say, well, what about us? Like, you're trying to that we shouldn't be regulated if they're not regulated. And so I'm wondering, well, if we get in before, if psychedelic churches and psilocybin churches get in and set that precedent with enough time, say if 10 years goes by before the government starts regulating psilocybin, and medicalizing.
Well, I mean, there's already.
Will it be harder to form an argument?
Think about this with Oregon. So here's one of the things: we were intimately involved in John's work with the religious access in Oregon, and one of the mandates in Oregon is obviously that you have to buy psilocybin. You can't give it away. But that is that's a central tenet of our organization, is that there is never a fee for the mushrooms. This is a gift of nature, and so it's a gift of you, harm reduction, and all that. So if what you're saying plays out, then let's again, okay, we have been spending 10 years giving sacrament to our members during services. Kentucky goes and forms a kind of psilocybin regulatory environment. Are they going to then be able to turn around and say to us, oh, well, no, now you have to sell the sacrament that you have been giving away, right? It's it's the order of operations here.
Well, I guess what also I hear is the evidence piece. Look, there's all these churches that are already doing it, and how should that change how we think about regulation? Which I think you're already seeing in Oregon in that advocacy. I just don't tend to think that you fit into that Oregon model. a religious community generally fits into the Oregon model. I also do think, I mean, the case law might not be there quite as much with cannabis, although I'd have to look back on, you know, case law with cannabis between the time that it was made illegal before it was starting to be medicalized. So that like 25-year period between the 70s and 94, where like the CSA puts put in place, and then we start getting medical cannabis in California. But I mean, there are plenty, we're definitely churches, and there are definitely people using it in religious settings, like all over the country, like for the whole time. It's just a matter of how public they were and how much they were on people's radars. So I think that's a piece. But I think the other big thing when I think about the future of psilocybin specifically in this country is like, one, people are saying it's super safe, more than maybe people say about LSD or, you know, even MDMA. The other is that, like, I don't think it's going to be a decade until FDA approves psilocybin assisted therapy. I think you're going to see the FDA approve psilocybin assisted therapy in the next 3 to 4 years. And that's like maybe being conservative. And so then once you have that, like, it's not going to, it's a very interesting world with psychedelics, because you have this FDA path, which you didn't really see the same way with cannabis. There was a few FDA approved cannabis synthetics, but like not in the same magnitude and not with the same attention. And then at the same time, you have the Oregon legal license framework. And then at the same time, you have these decriminalization efforts all over the place. So like in New York City right now, you can go buy mushrooms, you know, like lots of places. It's not even decrimmed there, but just the culture is there. And Michigan too, and DC too, in lots of places in Massachusetts too. And you've already seen also some states like I think Connecticut and I believe Colorado both passed laws that say, well, once the FDA approves these drugs, we're going to start dispensing them through expanded access frameworks. So it's not going to take Kentucky passing a law to say that Kentucky wants to regulate psilocybin for there to be psilocybin access in Kentucky. That's going to come once the FDA approves it. And like whether or not doctors in Kentucky will decide to give psilocybin or MDMA therapy, I don't believe they can be forced to, but it'll just be like any other, I mean, like abortion or other healthcare, where sometimes you might need to go to another state to get it. And that's a different kind of fight. Although there's a related religious freedom arguments being made on both sides, actually, with abortion and psychedelics.
Right. And well, then that brings up the consideration of, we have 22 states with the independent or the separate RFRA and the others that don't. And so as psychedelic access becomes more widespread, what are we going to see kind of two divergent pathways to how this looks? Because if in Oregon, if you can't operate a church in Oregon with the kind of, I don't want to say the less cost involved, or the more
limited regulation.
Limited regulation, but more importantly, it's greater access to the individual, right? So in Kentucky or states like Kentucky, Indiana, whatever, the RFA is so strong, when you can have these nonprofit communities that can do services on a donation basis or whatever, and then you've got these California and Oregon and Colorado and all this where there's not the RFRA, and so they're regulated and they have to have all the, there's just more cost involved. How is that going to create two almost divergent cultures or ways of practice? Does that make sense?
No, I think it's a fair question. It's like, well, what is the impact of having RFRA? But I mean, there's so many factors, because even with cannabis, every state's program looks different in terms of what kind of licenses they have and who's in the market and how much it costs. And like Oregon is just literally the tip of the iceberg with like psilocybin services. Like to me, like it's still very, very limited framework. But the thing about RFRA, which I think you're familiar with as well, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is the federal law, and then the state RFRAs, mini RFRAs, which are these state laws that a lot of states have passed. It's like they don't guarantee that you're protected, right? They just are a statute that you could use to defend yourself if someone was going to go after you. And so it's like any community, there's not, besides the very few communities, Santo Daime, UDV, and Native American Church, who have DEA exemptions, like it doesn't actually matter if you're in a state with a RFRA or a non-RFRA in terms of the federal government thinks what you're doing is illegal, and they could go after you if they wanted, and the IRS could go after you if they wanted, right? Like unless like whether you're a C3 that lied to them or you're a 508c1a who didn't disclose any activities to them, but you're acting as if you're a 508c1a, which means you are acting as if you're 501c3 compliant, even if you're doing a lot of the things you should be doing. The government could say, but you're doing something illegal and we're not okay with it. But the reason they're not doing that, and the same reason, well, similar reason maybe, that they're not going after all the illegal cannabis. I mean, there's so much. Like the federal government says any cannabis in food anywhere is illegal. Mm-hmm. And it's everywhere. I mean, everywhere. And even in like state licensed stores and states. So it's just like resources are a huge piece of that. The federal government has limited resources. And then specifically with religious use, it's not a good look for a state or for the federal government to be going after religious communities. They don't want to do it. They don't want to be fighting that in court. It's just like, it's not, so it's interesting. And that to me, I mean, one of the biggest takeaways from my research is like there's almost no way to be legal, but your risk of enforcement is pretty low. But the problem is that you can't take advantage of these nonprofit structures to their fullest capability. You can't really create access because there's this like, well, you're not getting charged, so you can't really challenge it. And like, I mean, I don't want anyone to be charged. I don't want anyone to get in trouble. And it's very hard to change laws if they're just taking a hands-off approach. Like even SoulQuest is still operating, right? Mm-hmm. Like they got their DEA exemption denied. They've gotten in trouble and they're still operating. Same with Zydor, right? Like they're still operating even though they got in trouble and now they're suing. So it's like, it's, I mean, I see these multiple paths, but to me, like and that's one of the arguments I think I would make if I'm talking to legislators or other lawyers. It's like, this makes the rule of law or the power of law look very weak. Like the federal government is just sitting here with its, arms crossed and its eyes looking around while all these communities are doing something. And the federal government has a duty to make it safer, or they have a duty to like not get in the way of communities making it safer. And that is like the biggest takeaway for me.
So I've been talking with an advocacy group who was pretty instrumental in getting medical marijuana legalized in Florida, but they don't see psilocybin having, they don't see the same value in advocating at the federal level for psilocybin for multiple reasons. And I'm just, what could we do to help more groups get involved in changing legislation, especially if, like you said, they're just sitting there with their arms crossed and pretending like they don't see what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, education is one piece. And that's part of the reason I'm motivated to write a book. And I'm encourage anyone else who has things to say to write about it, to normalize it, to talk about it, knowing that there are varying degrees of risk in doing that for different people. And I mean, I think it is interesting because it's like psychedelics and cannabis are on similar but different paths. And so like advocating at the federal level, like we can't even get cannabis through. Like there's so much stigma, there's so much misinformation, there's so much miseducation. So legislators thinking about psilocybin, I mean, it is pretty incredible. We had some research bills get through. I think like focusing on that, hey, like this is really helping people. Like there are definitely people, and I'm sure you've met them too, who say, wow, I heard that this is amazing for trauma. Like I want to learn more, and that it's like that extreme trauma or that extreme healing. And so my hope is, in 5 years that after some of these FDA trials are finalized and people are getting them through the medical model, that the stigma helps push forward. But I mean, I also don't think we need to be waiting for the federal government. Like my approach in terms of cannabis policy, because I have my hands in lots of places, but when I think about federal cannabis policy and the work I do around interstate commerce and around what the federal law should look like for cannabis, like to me, there are people that saying, oh, we need to let the federal government figure out what they want to do about cannabis. We need to suspend the Constitution. We need to limit interstate commerce. We need to, like there are literally scholars in cannabis at universities that are saying this. To me, it's crazy. So that we can let the federal government figure out what it wants to do. And it's like the federal government has decided. They haven't done anything for decades. Like the states are the primary regulators of cannabis, and all we need is for the federal government to get out of the way, period. Take away 280E, take away any potential limits on interstate commerce, and let us have the free market. That's literally the whole point of the United States, is we have a whole bunch of states, and we can work together, and we can have commerce among each other. So like the cannabis market is like a failure. So I think a lot of people in psychedelics are afraid of it looking the same. And I mean, that's a big issue with Oregon too, which was really funny to me. I mean, I love these people. They're they have so much good heart. Like everyone, I think in religious use specifically, not everyone, but a lot of people are in it for really good reasons. We want to create access. We want to help people. But when I said to my friends advocating in Oregon, like, well, why would a church want to apply for a license? And they're like, well, they could be protected. And it's like, no, when you think about a license, when it comes to cannabis, a license comes with expenses. It comes with burdens. It comes with requirements. Like licensing does not equal freedom, and licensing doesn't equal access. License equals limitations and burdens and taxes. So that's
if you remember the first video, how was it we became aware of Measure 109 or the
someone that I worked with in Jamaica?
Yeah, someone sent Eric a message one night, and we had some sanctuary members visiting from Oregon, and they were staying at our house, and he got this message like, hey, did you know there's this not public hearing, but a subcommittee meeting on Zoom about Measure 109 and entheogenic practitioners being included. And we were all like, oh, we got to watch this. And we tuned in and we were just like sweating, like, why is this happening? What I thought like, why are religious frameworks being worked into a government, like regulatory, like what's going on? And we made this podcast with our members, and we were just all fired up. And I think it came across kind of like we were upset. And John Dennis saw it.
I am, yeah.
And he was like,
pretty upset about it.
right, yeah, right. And because it's, very confusing, like, hold on, like we're not applying to the DEA for a reason. So why would we be applying to Oregon for permission? But anyway, we kind of cleared things up. We later had a podcast with John.
It was John. I think John, because they had brought Sanctuary up. They were using Sanctuary as an example on this call. And so anyway, I just think it's going to be really funny when we have people going from Kentucky to Oregon for abortions and people from Oregon coming to Kentucky for psilocybin. Just
what is going on?
What is happening?
Oh man.
I mean, you like being involved in law and religion for all these years. Sometimes do you look around and you're just like, what the heck is going on? How did we get here this quickly?
Yeah. I mean, this came out on Gary's podcast, and people don't like it when I say it, but it's like, we don't really have separation of church. We're in a Christian country. And so like religion, I mean, it like surprises me and it doesn't surprise me. Like where we are in terms of like normalized religious practices being the default law and maybe less normalized religions being criminal. You know, like that's basically where we're at, where it's like, but it's not, that wasn't how I mean, whether or not this was supposed to be a country that was free for all religions or just free for people to find Christianity is like a historical debate. And it depends on who you ask. Jefferson would say, you could be anything you want. I mean, probably Christian, but like everyone else was like, oh, you should be Christian, but I want you to come to it on your own terms. Like,
little reverse psychology.
Yeah, exactly. Reverse psychology. Exactly. But it is wild where we are in this country.
So we have a lot of people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I guess all I would just say is it's also very difficult, like all these conversations around federal policy, even state policy, like we're in such a time of political instability in this country. So like the idea that we're going to have a federal government that has money to enforce any laws at all in like 5 years is like, you know, I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm just being realistic. Yeah. What were you going to say? Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, probably once a week, twice a week, we get emails from people saying, hey, I want to start a psychedelic church like you. Where do I start? And I'm just curious, surely you must hear similar things. Do you have an elevator deterrent or pitch? I don't know. Are you trying to deter people from starting psychedelic churches or encourage it right now?
I think right now, because I sit in cannabis and psychedelics, and in terms of my practice, my focus, my passion, and in the cannabis world, when people are like, "Oh, I want to go legal," I'm like, "Are you sure? Are you sure you want to go legal? Because it's going to be really expensive and really hard, and you're probably like not going to be successful." And as a lawyer, it's really hard because even like the people that have gotten cannabis licenses, most of them operate in some legally gray interstate market because it's just so difficult to be successful. So I actually find the church space to be a little bit more comfortable in some ways because it is more legally gray, right? Like it is like, it's not like, oh, well, there's a state law that says, I mean, there's state criminal laws, there are federal criminal laws, but I believe that the religious use of these is and should be constitutionally protected. I think that like it is sincere. And so I guess my approach when people say, oh, well, should I start a church? What should I do? Should I apply for C3, 508c1A? What can I do? I mean, one element of it is, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to change the landscape, or are you trying to fly under the radar? One element is, how are you structuring yourself? Obviously, understanding more about what a church wants to do and what kind of activities they want to conduct is helpful. I mean, I love that you all, and I'm a tax nerd, like corporate nerd. So I'm all about structuring things very coolly. Like, I think you could have like a for-profit and a nonprofit, and they do work together, or you could have your church, and you guys, I know, have like some other I don't know, brands or companies. We can talk another time, but like to say, oh, you have more than integration. You have like all these different, and they could be, you could have, and so this is usually the conversation I have with people. It's like, well, what are you trying to do? And like, how can I help you do it in a way that's sort of like, harm reduction from a corporate formation perspective. How do we reduce like risks that you might have enforcement? How do we maximize your ability to capitalize on tax exempt status, if that's what you want to do? And how do we allow you to have an operating business with a business account? And maybe that looks like a subsidiary to your nonprofit, or maybe it looks like a separate entity and you guys can do the work together, or, and like me trying to make sure as a lawyer that I'm advising people of legal risks and, ensuring that I feel comfortable that, and how I'm advising people. And it takes time to get to know people and their communities. There are still people outside the world who say, oh, religion is just an excuse to use drugs. And there are maybe people in the world who tongue in cheek are like, oh, let me start a church so I can avoid regulation. And like, those aren't really the people that I'm most interested in working with. I'm most interested in people who are like, we see the value in community and we want to build something to be a container for community and spiritual experience and prolonged healing, which I think is what religion is all about.
Yes. So can we talk more about this aspect of community in a legitimate church? Because that's for us the same thing. And we talk about this a lot, but I think it's always valuable to have more voices on this conversation. A church is not a building. It's not a practice. And that's where this idea of centrality really comes in, that the church is the community. And so, thinking as a psychedelic church, we often talk about what we can do to change the perspective in our broader community, leveraging the resource of our community. So what are you seeing in that in terms of, nationally? Are you seeing more churches that are psychedelic churches that are getting really community involved and are developing a unique community themselves?
Well, I will say I was like listening to some of your episodes of your podcast, like trying to like tune in, and there was one about community, just to get an idea of what you talk about and how so before I came on. And I loved, Courtney, you talked about ice skating as your community growing up. I believe, was that you? Yeah.
Yep.
So I grew up an ice skater too. So you had
really?
me. Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Okay.
My mom is like still a judge. So, but like I really resonated.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, lots to talk about then.
Yeah. And so for me, like skating and then also my synagogue were just like core communities for me as a kid, places where, people know your name, but just like you feel connected and you feel, common purpose. And I would say I've been disappointed, in most psychedelic churches that I'm seeing, and that I don't see that, which is one of the things that really excites me about your work. And I think part of that, though, is the law, right? It makes it so hard. And I mean, this kind of goes back to Courtney's point earlier about not everyone wants to go to the church. But right now, because access is so limited, I think some churches are catering to people that aren't interested in community, but are interested in access to medicine. So like, they're like, oh, we're a church and we do ceremonies and you can come and get your healing ceremony and you pay me, or, maybe like a Soul Quest vibe. I don't know. I'm not here but just like, okay, the transaction here is medicine for money, so to speak, as opposed to, I loved it. The woman who presented on Santa Daime, I should remember her name, incredible PhD student from Santa Cruz. She said people come for the medicine, but they stay for the music. And they stay for the dancing, and it's like they stay for the community. A lot of people in that community, but I think like coming for the community and staying for the community would be the best, right? And then like what that community can show you and how that community can hold your experiences. And it's interesting because people think psychedelic experiences are like the only ones I'm talking about. No, like when you lose someone in your family, right? Or like when you have a marriage or you have you have children, like that's a community event. And can be celebrated and processed. And, but yeah, no, I've been disappointed in psychedelic churches.
Yeah, it is such a gray area. And, that's something that's part of our membership. A part of our membership process is is a group discovery call. Now it used to be one-on-one, but the demand, we had so many people becoming members or wanting to become members that we had to make it a group discovery call, which actually became a huge benefit to our membership process, because incoming new members were meeting other new members, and it's now giving an immediate impression that if you're coming just for sacrament, then you're in the wrong place. Like if you come here and you want to be a member, it's for the community. And yes, like we are gathered around sacrament, which is the mushroom, but it's the community that makes the experience. It's the ongoing integration through our events, through our sacred circles that we have every Wednesday, through our potlucks, through like all these celebrations about life and the divine that, like you said earlier, like that's a daily communion that we have in all kinds of ways. And it happens through our children and these big life events, death, separation, like we need each other just as much, if not more, than we need sacrament to commune with each other. So it is so important. It's a regular conversation. And now, like when it comes to our sacrament retreats, we tell people, you need to be present. We had to set some kind of standard for people to understand that in order to commune with us, with our organization and our sacrament, then you need to be present for, at minimum, 3 Sunday services before you sign up for a retreat. And there's so many reasons why. It's not just for like protection, like down the road if something were to happen, but like because where it's at is community. And if you're not already coming together with our community before you commune, you're going to feel it, and we're all going to feel it. And it's going to, greatly impact your experience on either end. So that's felt really good since we've instituted that policy within our organization. It's felt really good.
I think too, I mean, it echoes, and you were saying this earlier, Eric, in terms of like medical efficacy, but this idea around like like the healing is not in the sacrament, it's in the community. To me, I learned about that first, like that idea of that. I spent a summer after I graduated college, sort of like living with and learning from this indigenous community in Peru. I was there for like 6-7 weeks, and I was drawn to this program because I heard from a professor whose mom was like, oh, like they use ayahuasca, they talk about ayahuasca use. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to learn about this culture to try and understand more like how they use ayahuasca. Spoiler alert, I decided not to do ayahuasca there. It was not my experience, my time to do it, or yet in general. But I went and I traveled. It was fascinating to me because the program was actually even more about agricultural techniques than it was about ayahuasca use. But it's obviously this interconnectedness between how you experience the world, your relationship with the world, your relationship with yourself. I mean, it was so powerful. But as part of that trip, we visited, there was a research center called Taquiwazi, based in Tarapoto, Peru. And it was run by a doctor who was working with Doctors Without Borders. But they were doing a research study there on like some French people that were addicted to other types of drugs who were coming to Peru, and they were living in this community and they were using ayahuasca. And what the doctor told me, which has stuck with me, which I think is missing in so many of our research, all of it, is that the benefit actually, like these people were coming to Taquiwazi, they were using ayahuasca. They were also, doing journaling. They were engaging with community. They were setting ritual. They were having meals. There was so much more than just that experience. And they found that when they left the community and went home, a lot of them weren't able, they were like, receding back into their addictions, and which is, not that surprising. I mean, it's sad. I mean, I would love for it to be a quick fix, right? It would be great if you could just go to a retreat somewhere and come home and everything's great. But like, that's the integration piece, and it's the long-term community piece. Like even with AA, like the meetings, it's about community, right? Like it's not, and it's connection to the divine. And yes, it's reminding yourself of what it means to be connected and to feel. But it really is the community piece. And then I was leaving that experience like, so you're saying it's not really about the drug at all? Like, it's really about the community? And it's like, wow, I wish we could sell that to the FDA, right? Like, man.
Well, I think we will eventually, that's the example that we're going to see. It may be, after the fact that that's all realized, obviously, but it was for us too. We went in Jamaica, we did Michael meditations there, and we saw so many people helped. And then 6 months down the road, because they didn't have the community support, and they just kind of fell back into old habits. And what we're seeing now from that was the big thing. When Courtney and I came back from Micah and we decided to do this here, our whole premise was that we are going to build community, because we saw what happens when you have the drugs. I mean, for us then, it was still a sacrament. This has always been a spiritual practice from our very first time. But you see what's missing when you don't have that ongoing community piece. And it has been just it's so hard to express how incredibly valuable it is. And the people that we're seeing, we have a lot of people here locally and nationally, but locally we see it even more so, where individuals who are coming in have never had this kind of ability to talk about anything. And I think that's one of the great values that psychedelic communities, if they're really living the ethics of psychedelia, is that you are willing to face anything and you're willing to move through it together. And so providing that space for people who have never had that in their lives, they come to the meetings and then they have their first experience and they're like, the mushrooms were great. Yeah. But I was changing before I got the mushrooms just because of this container. I love that you're speaking to that.
Gives me like shivers. I mean, like I married a rabbi for a lot of reasons, but I love being in community, and like I was really involved in youth group, and that's how we initially met. But one of the values is like getting to be rooted in community. Like I don't think I could do this work if I didn't have like people that were there for me. I mean, period.
Well, let me ask about that. I mean, you're certainly an outlier in the legal community, but that's changing. Obviously, you're part of the psychedelic bar, but how is that kind of sub-community forming? What's the culture of that world, and what kind of support are you all providing for each other in this very weird landscape that you're navigating?
You mean as in like religious lawyers that help? Yeah, lawyers that help religious use. It's hard. I think one big thing is we all know that what we do impacts each other. So trying to stay connected. I mean, one thing I've tried to do, and our Psychedelic Bar Association committee, we run on consensus. So even though I had the same reaction you both had on like, I'm actually angry that you're telling me that my church should have to go to the health authority and apply for a license. Like, what are you talking about? But there was enough people that felt like that needed to be part of the conversation. And there are people in that community who feel like talking about how religious use fits in with the state framework is important. So I've had to say, okay, like, it's not about me. It's not about what I think. It's about like a consensus. And if all of you want this conversation to move forward, I'm going to voice my concern. I'm going to come out here and tell people about my concern. And I'm going to support the other advocates who are pushing forward their idea about the future, because none of us own what it's going to look like. None of us get to, like, we're all just doing our best. Like, I really genuinely think John has like very good intentions, and his work is very important. And I might not agree with it. But as a consensus organization, I didn't do like thumbs down, no non-starter. I didn't stop our community of legal practitioners from supporting him doing that work. And I hope that as I continue to do work, I'll get that same kind of support, and just, trying to educate each other. I'm doing some psychedelic. There's like an online law summit being held by the Bar Association, and I'm helping speak on religious use in that. And so for me, a huge part is education. I mean, I'm just trying to like put because everyone brings different things to the conversation. Some people have been lawyers and litigators for decades, and I don't have that. But I've been in school, and a lot of these people, because they're coming to it a little bit later, when they were in law school, they weren't studying this, right? Like I literally was in classes on religion and law presenting on psychedelic churches. And it's because of the work of John, or Martha Hartney's another great example, or Sean McAllister, other lawyers, Allison Hoots, who wrote a great guide. Like, they allow me to do the work I'm doing. I'm building off their work in some ways. And then now I'm like, let me come back to you and tell you like what these, stuffy legal academics say, and what kind of arguments we can use. Like, just trying to take, collaborate, I think would be the key way to answer that question, is we're trying to support and collaborate. And not everyone is maybe in on that, right? And like, that's a challenge. Because there are lawyers that'll say, oh, religious use, we should just create another administrative agency and make it harder for churches. I'm like, you've clearly never talked to a church or thought about this, but all right, guy, like you win. Like, I don't know. So I'm not saying it's perfect, right?
Well, no community is, and that's one of the beautiful things about community, is that if we're coming together authentically, then we're working it out as we go. It's a living organism in itself.
Yeah. So shout out to my mom and dad, who are both attorneys. And So this has been a really interesting conversation to navigate, just as far as psychedelics and what Eric and I have been doing with them as attorneys. They've been some of our best, like walls to bounce ideas off of. And, because I just grew up with them, they're attorneys, they love to argue and they love to debate. And so they've actually been really great with us doing the work that we've been doing. But I've learned from them, and my mom in particular, that attorneys have some of the highest rates of suicide amongst professions, which, growing up with attorneys, I can see why, because it's such stressful work. And so I'm really curious for you, being an attorney, what's that like with your peers who are attorneys, as far as them using psychedelics? Is that something that's being talked about? Are attorneys being open with that? Or I don't know, what are you seeing?
That's a good question. I thought you were going to ask me, how do I deal with the stress of being a lawyer? No, I'm just.
Well, I'm curious about that too.
No.
Cannabis daily.
Cannabis daily.
Cannabis daily. Time off. No. I have a great setup because I joined a firm, but I'm basically my own boss and set my own schedule. So a lot of the lawyer challenges are when you go to a firm and you're an associate and they just stomp on you. You work a million hours and you don't get any say on what you're doing. So I'm giving up, the $200,000+ a year salary, but I get freedom and the ability to actually try and help people that I've been working so hard to do. But I think it's interesting in both cannabis and psychedelics. It's frustrating how many people are in it and don't use at all. And it's cool when you meet an investor, someone's like, oh yeah, of course I use, how could I invest if I don't know? And I was like, well, tell that to that guy over there, because he's telling me, how can I can't use my own supply, whatever. It's people still have all this stigma around it. So I think that is there's a great lawyer, if you haven't met her yet, Courtney Barnes. She helped with decriminalize nature. She's written a lot of legislation, someone I definitely want to help think about how we decrim religious use. And I saw her speak at an event this weekend, and one of her big challenges to people was talk about your experiences. When you've had healing experiences, you need to be transparent about that. And I get that sometimes people will read Michael Pollan's book and say, well, he's an old white dude, so of course he can write a book about how he used psychedelics and no one's going to even think twice about it. So I think understanding that there are limits to people's comfortability, I would say people don't talk about it enough. I try and talk about it. I think it is, it's scary, right? To know, Brian Marascu, I don't know how you say his last name, wrote that book about called The Immortality Key, about how there's a root in Christianity of psychedelics. And then I heard him on a podcast saying, well, I would never do it. It's illegal. And I'm just all right, guy, you're so cool. You spent 8 years of your life writing a book about psychedelics and then want to say, well, I wouldn't do that. Those people break the law. I'm dude, did you learn nothing? I swear. So, it's people telling themselves is the point. People telling themselves and you're okay, you're okay.
I feel the same way about Paul Stamets, honestly. Paul Stamets for 30 years or whatever has been, the mushroom man, but he would not talk about psychedelic experiences. And then now, of course, he's looking to patent his own special blend of psilocybin and lion's mane. It's just anyway, if you've got the privilege, then you should be using it to help forward the cause.
Yeah. And it's so much of it is legally gray. Excuse me. I live in legally gray. And in my own choices, I do the same kind of risk assessment. What is the risk of enforcement? If it was enforced against me, what are the risks? And there are risks involved in every choice we make. And there are definitely people, and just doctors, all kinds of professionals who have to be afraid of their job for using even cannabis. And I made a decision once cannabis really changed my life of I'm not going to consider a job that's going to require me to not use, to me, yes. My own personal health and wellness takes priority over anything else.
Yes.
And that's a risk.
Well, thank you for taking the risk. I know it is a risk for you to be so public. And, 10 years ago, I was saying we need more women out here saying yes to psychedelics publicly, because men have been puking in the street for millennia. It's no big deal. Right?
Yeah. Right.
So thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say there's a great woman who I really admire, Catherine McLean, who was a researcher at Hopkins, and she started her Twitter now. It's called Psychedelic Momming, and she has kids. And I love that. Like, just to echo on your point, like the stigma around women using these drugs and using them to help them be better parents and better people. So I just giving her a shout out, but just in general, the idea, hell yeah, women talking about our use.
For sure.
Absolutely.
And minorities as well. I mean, God,
everyone.
Prisons. Yeah. But the people, particularly the people who have been marginalized most for substances, I think there's a great value in those being some of the most prevalent voices. I mean, I had a lot of family go down in cannabis as imprisoned and whatnot. And so I have felt like that makes it part of my responsibility that my family lost thousands of acres of land because of cannabis. Then I have a responsibility to say no more. And, other marginalized groups, while it's more challenging for them to speak up, like the strength in numbers is undeniable. And the more we just leverage that, then the faster we'll move forward. So anyway, big thanks. I want to be mindful of your time. We're at almost 90 minutes here now. I feel like we could talk for a long time.
Yeah, especially now that I know your mom's a judge.
Yeah.
So, right?
Well, I hope I'll be able to come back, and as I do more writing and talking, and that we'll continue to be able to collaborate, online, offline, any places, and the strength in numbers thing. I mean, I guess one thing I could kind of close on, or just, if you are listening to this, or as you talk to more people, like part of the strength in numbers is embracing religions that already exist that don't use psychedelics, because plenty of them are already 501c3s. They already are people who are interested in community. So that's a huge group that I want to educate in terms of like, how could this just add to your practice? And it involves education from the top down. I mean, from religious leaders and seminaries. And I think those people are going to come to you. They should be coming to you to say, how do we do this kind of work? Because you guys are already doing that work. So I think, religious engagement is sort of dying, at least some religious engagement in this country is dying. There's a rise of religious nuns, Nones. But I think if religion engages with psychedelics and cannabis and creates meaning and containers for use for people, I mean, that would definitely is wanting to help create that future is a part of what grounds me in my faith, even though my faith doesn't use psychedelics or cannabis right now in my community. The idea that in the future I can bring these two things together really motivates me. And I know I'm not alone. So I think the strength in numbers is going to come from all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Such a good point.
Awesome. Get our closing question?
Yes, we always ask our guests, what does psilocybin say to you?
Oh, man. I mean, and I listened to your stuff before, and I heard you ask this question to people, and I could have known it was coming. And I guess, it's just, psilocybin is very deep to me and connected. It's like one of the deepest, so rooted. So like when people, I never understood like a tree hugger until I ate mushrooms. Like my feet are on the roots, and I'm like, we are all here together in this world, and I'm just feeling so like deeply connected. So that's, I guess, what psilocybin says to me.
That's beautiful.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, and I would love to have you on the show again. And I did want to ask you, your book, you mentioned you're writing a book. So what's the ETA on that dropping?
I'm like my editor texting me. Hopefully the end of this year. Sometimes things take as long as they take, and I'm moving forward on a lot of fronts. And some part of me knows that when it comes out, it will already be too late. Like it should be out last year. And the other part of me knows that like when it comes out, it will still be ahead of its time. Because I'm writing a collection of essays based on stuff I've already written, dealing with the history and the present and the future of religion and drugs and law and religious identity. And so, I think our conversation too will inform what I'm writing. And the more I say it to people, the more I'm like, I got to keep pushing forward. A big project takes a while, and I want it to be good and done right. But hopefully the end of this year, my goal would for it to come out in 2023. But pieces of it are coming out through presentations I'm doing, through tweets. I love being on Twitter and talking to awesome people there. So hopefully coming soon, and you'll be among the first to know.
Awesome.
Excellent.
We'll link all of your sites and where people can find you in the show notes. So anyone listening, look below for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time today and all of your work, Victoria.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, likewise, really. I look forward to hopefully talking again soon.